We all want to play fantastic lines in our solos, but one of the worst things that you can do is to just try to solo at full speed and hope that it's going to get better. And that is how a lot of people go about it. I've certainly done that myself quite often. And when you do that, it's a bit like trying to learn Chinese by watching a Chinese movie with Chinese subtitles. You'll probably get there, but it's going to take a few years. So you should slow things down and really work on playing stronger lines by having time to listen to them and figure out how to make them better before you're blasting away at full speed. Now, the best way to work on that is by composing lines. And I'm going to show you how I do that and talk about what the benefits are and what you need to pay attention to, because this is about a lot more than just practicing slowly. Let's say that you want to become better at using the arpeggio from the third of the chord in your solos. Just to keep it simple, let's take a single chord and then work on that. So D minor 7 in the key of C major. So of course, the third of D minor is F, and in C major, the arpeggio that you're going to come across here would be an F major 7 arpeggio. Now, just knowing this is not immediately going to be something that's going to just appear magically in your solos. You need to work on being able to make some lines with that. So in this case, we just need to come up with some different lines and practice putting this arpeggio together with all the other things that we want to use when we're soloing on a D minor chord in the key of C. So let's start with the arpeggio. Now, just to lead into it, we can add something. So we can add maybe a chromatic enclosure. So already this sounds a little bit more interesting, and there's something happening. We have some chromatic movement, and then we get the arpeggio. And of course, the arpeggio really connects well with the sound. It's kind of creating like a D minor 9 on top of this D minor chord. Now from here, I can add like another chromatic phrase. So first we get the enclosure, then the arpeggio, then I'm going up to the third, and then adding an enclosure of the root. So kind of skipping down to the C sharp to target the root here, the D, and then just running down the triad. So, and then we have this line. Of course, you want to do more with the arpeggio and be a little bit more creative with the lines that you're making. One way that works really well for bebop is, of course, to play the arpeggio as a triplet with a leading note. So that would be essentially this melody. Now from here, I can actually just take something that I think I first really noticed with George Benson. He does it all the time, but he clearly stole that from Charlie Parker. And that is to have this really fast ascending arpeggio melody. And then as a contrast, have a chromatic run going down again. So then you have this. Now I actually already have most of my lines, so that's kind of just using stuff that I've taken in solos, actually both from Parker and Benson. Maybe as a contrast to this, just to have a different sound again in the melody. It's very nice to have these different sounds within one part that's really arpeggio, then something that's maybe more scale, and something that's more chromatic. So here, it's becoming actually kind of like a pentatonic melody. So I'm kind of using D minor pentatonic. So I'm coming out on the C after the chromatic run. And then this melody, which is essentially just like a D minor triad with a G in there as well. But I think definitely something that sort of looks and feels like a pentatonic scale run. But maybe it also makes sense to compose a line that's not like 2/3 of a Parker quote. So if we start with the arpeggio again, so with the triplet here, actually we can also just pair it with not a chromatic run, but more like a scale run. So, and then I'm really just running down the pentatonic scale, but with a different melody now. And then adding some chromaticism at the end. And when you're working like this, then I think it is as much the process that's important as it is the result. So usually I would never write down licks like this. I would just make a lot of them, because what I'm practicing is actually making the licks. And that's something that I can sort of then bring into my playing, because then I will do the same process when I'm improvising. And I think that's what you want to aim for. But of course, it does pay off to sometimes also just write down what you come up with, especially because then you can go back and look at it and maybe wonder if you can make something better or if you're in a tight spot and can't come up with something, maybe you can go back and take a part of something you already wrote. So that's really useful. But in general, you want to focus on doing better than just playing the right notes. Just playing the right notes is not that interesting. You need to make sure that you can actually play some really interesting and strong melodies, and you want to work on having a vocabulary of that as well. You don't want to think only about, okay, I'm playing the notes of the chord and I'm landing on the ninth, but you also want to think about, well, does this melody sound interesting? That's also why I was talking about in the previous example that you have like an arpeggio run, and then you get a contrast with a chromatic movement. And I think these kind of contrasts are something you want to also think about when you're trying to come up with your material and trying to play better solos and play better lines. Otherwise, you're just working on playing something that should work because it's following the rules, but that's just not how music works. So it's not enough to just think, okay, I want to use the arpeggio from the third. You can go a lot further than that. Let's just try and see if we can come up with some lines where I'm using the arpeggio from the third, but I'm not just playing that, I'm also adding in other notes or doing something with that arpeggio, and in that way trying to make it a more interesting line. So one thing you could do when you have an arpeggio, very often you can add scale melody in the beginning of that arpeggio. So instead of playing, I'll now be playing, which is really just adding one note, but it's just a different melody that I can have in there. So that might work. So I'm playing that arpeggio, and then that becomes the first note in an enclosure of the D, and then rounding that off with a D minor pentatonic line. And again, with this line, I'm not just playing, or I'm really trying to find lines that are skipping around more and are more interesting, because you don't really want to have bebop lines or jazz lines that just sound like. That's not really going to be very interesting to listen to, and it's super predictable, and you need to have stuff that's sort of changing direction and making it more surprising to the listener. And one of the ways you can do that is, of course, to have these sort of quick fluctuations. Another thing that you can do that works really well, that I actually already did in one of the previous examples, is that whenever you have a chromatic enclosure of a note, and essentially that's just this melody, but when I'm doing this, then I'm adding a chromatic enclosure, but instead of playing it, which would sort of be much more sort of the straight line, but it's also kind of boring, then I flip that around and skip all the way down to the C sharp, just to really have a larger interval in there. Back up to the second note of that enclosure, and then resolving it. So you have, I think you can hear it, it's quite clear that the first one is much more interesting to listen to. And to give you another example of where you can sort of really work with the melodies, pivot arpeggios or octave displacement is just a great way to create more interesting melodies with material that you already know. So in this case, of course, that's our F major 7 arpeggio. If I start on the F here and then just move the rest of the arpeggio down an octave, then I have, and this is, of course, again, because it's a melody that's just skipping around more and moving in different directions, it's a lot more interesting to listen to. So we can make that into a line and see if we can couple it with some other stuff like. So the process is that I'm first figuring out how to play the arpeggio, and then adding that and trying to figure out how I can fit it together with other stuff that I play. So in this case, I'm using a leading note and then playing a D minor 7 arpeggio. So, and then adding that last phrase to really get that E out there, and that way sort of get the color across on the chord. And I'm just making choices along the way, just trying things out and see how it fits together and if I like the sound. And this process is really also what you see in action if you go to a Barry Harris masterclass. Or at least, since he is no longer with us, then if you see a video of one of his masterclasses, what he does is that he takes these different building blocks and puts them together in a great way, really creating super strong bebop lines. And that is definitely a way that you want to practice, and definitely something that a lot of people have learned a lot from. Now that you're anyway working at this slower tempo, then there is another thing that I think you want to fix in your playing. Because when you're playing a jazz solo, you want to really nail the changes and you want to really connect with the chords. And usually that means that you're playing lines that have sort of strong chord tones on beat 1 and beat 3. And of course, that's great for connecting with the harmony, but very often that also means that your lines don't really sound that great because they get really heavy. So that means that your solo sounds like 1, 3, 1, 3. And that's just a lot more Megadeth than it is Metheny or Martino. So you don't want to play lines like this. Because here I'm really just moving from 1 to 3 to 1 to 3, and there's no syncopation, there's no life in that phrase. So there are a few things that you can start to add to your lines that are actually kind of easy to figure out if you're working on composing lines like this. And once you start to do that, you also start to notice how that works when you're playing a real solo, and it's going to improve how you sound really a lot. The first part of this is that you don't want to end on the downbeat. So in this example, I was ending on a heavy beat, and really what you want to try to do is just to always add a note after that and get that to make sense in the melody. So let's just take the F major 7 arpeggio. Already when playing this, I'm actually ending on an offbeat, right? So that will work. But we can also add something after that. I'm really just adding a small scale run after I'm playing it, and I'm ending on this note that's not on a downbeat, and in that way it's still sort of a logical ending because I'm ending on the root of the chord, so that makes sense, but it's not being played like as this heavy downbeat that sort of sounds like the final note in a symphony. The other thing you can do is to try and create melodies in your lines that naturally will have high notes on the offbeat, and that those high notes are sort of followed by stuff that's moving down. Because when you do that, then you can sort of naturally add an accent, and that will immediately sound like a great bebop line. And a very simple example of that could sound something like this. Essentially just playing that F major 7 arpeggio, but I'm adding like a chromatic leading note and the D in there. And because it's moving down, I'm starting on the beat, then I can add this accent to the chromatic note in here, and that gives me two things. It's giving me an accent on a high note in the context because everything that comes after this is lower, and it's also a note that is creating some tension because it's a chromatic leading note. So I'm really giving sort of the interesting or the tension note an accent, and then making the resolution a little bit weaker, and in that way making the line and the interesting part of the line stand out. So here you have it very clearly because I'm playing the arpeggio. And then after that, going up to the F, and this of course on 3 so that's on an offbeat, and I can give that an accent. Also because it's moving down to D and C afterwards, so. And that sort of brings some syncopation and some rhythm into the line, even though it's actually just a line of a lot of notes, it's pretty dense, then you're still adding some rhythmical quality to it and some phrasing to it. And that's definitely something you want to develop in your playing. And also, once you start working on it, it's something you're going to start to hear in the playing of others, all the solos that you like, they all have this. This probably means that you need to change the way that you think about your own solo lines and need to start working on making them stronger as melodies, and not only thinking about what are the notes against the chord or what scale am I using, and you need to dig a little bit deeper, but then you're also going to sound a lot better. And if you want to see some examples from somebody who is really good at this, then check out this video where I'm going over 10 examples from Charlie Parker, and there really is a reason why he's considered a musical genius.